Okay, hi all. Welcome to the Module 3 case study. This one's going to be short as I know the other video was a bit long. All we're going to do today is use one example, basically one engraving, which is a type of image, to look at a historical event, the Boston Massacre, which is a 1770 event along the path of American patriots trying to push for independence with Great Britain, or at least resistance to Great Britain and British taxation. And the purpose of this is, yes, to learn a little bit about the Boston Massacre, but primarily to think about how we can use primary sources, right, things from the time that aren't necessarily text, right? It is important as historians to learn how to analyze texts, but we also need to think about how things like images, maps, physical objects can be useful ways into history. So we're going to focus today on analyzing an image, right, and using that to understand the ideas behind the Boston Massacre and propaganda around it. So the image we're going to use is this one. Now, before I talk about the image, I'll just give you like a 1-minute version of what the Boston Massacre was. So in 1770 in Boston, Massachusetts, tensions were very high between Bostonians and the British military. This is after the Stamp Act, but before the Boston Tea Party. And so there were people were very angry with the British, especially over issues around taxation. And there were a lot of British soldiers stationed in Boston in case there was trouble with Bostonians. But British soldiers aren't paid very well. And so in their off time, they would try and pick up other work. And they would do it for really cheap, cheaper than laborers in Boston would work. And so there was additional tension between the working class in Boston and British soldiers because they were competing for work. And so in one day in March of 1770, a British soldier gets into some conflict with a crowd of Bostonians. It's unclear what is exactly going on. Some people say it was over like an unpaid barber's bill, to get his haircut. But whatever it was, tensions escalate. About 8 more British soldiers show up. The crowd of Bostonians starts throwing snowballs and stuff at them, threatening them with clubs. The British soldiers, who are heavily armed, panic. One of the soldiers fires, probably without an order from an officer. The other soldiers open fire into the crowd, and a few Bostonians are killed. The British kill them. After this happens, it causes a huge uproar in the city of Boston, right? And around the American colonies. And there are all these questions. Did the British officer give the order to fire? Did the officers fire on their own? Will the officers be held accountable for what they did? Will they be protected by Britain? What caused this incident, right? And also, what does this mean for the relationship between American colonists and the British? And so after this happens, this event in Boston in March of 1770, both sides, the British and the Patriots, start putting out their own propaganda to try and basically spin what happened and say, no, this is the real story of what happened. No, it was this that happened, right? And so this image that we're going to look at in this little case study video is an engraving, which is this thing here, basically a picture that could be printed easily. They couldn't print photos, or they couldn't even take photos, of course, at this time. And this engraving was produced by a silversmith, who is relatively well known in history because his name was Paul Revere, right? He's best known for his Midnight Ride. But Paul Revere produces this engraving to tell the story of what happened. And it's going to get posted as a poster and printed in newspapers all over, right? It would be black and white, so any color versions like this are colored by hand, not printed that way. So this image is not a static, unbiased document, right? This is Paul Revere trying to persuade his audience, whoever looks at this, of what happened. So you can see here, it says engraved and sold by Paul Revere of Boston. And we're going to take a look at some different sort of close-ups of this image. But first, I want you to take a minute, and I'll kind of pause for a second to look for a couple things. One is, how are the British portrayed on the right versus how the Americans, the Bostonians, are portrayed on the left? And take a second to look at their clothing, their body language, and their faces. And you can pause the video for maybe 30 seconds and do that. I'm not going to just sit here in silence. Okay, now that you've done that, we're going to start taking a look at some close-ups to see some things that might be kind of hard to see in this. And so keep in mind, some of the things that were controversial were, one, what time did this happen? Which seems like a weird thing to be controversial, but it was. Did the British soldiers act in an organized and unison way, or was it kind of haphazard and not based on orders? Were the Americans, the Bostonians, aggressive in attacking them, or were they fired upon without any provocation? Not that the provocation would excuse it. Was there anybody else involved, right? So if we zoom in, we can see, one, this image looks kind of different. It's the same engraving, but it's a different copy. It was colored in by a different person, so it looks a little different. And we can see here, this is like a slightly higher quality one, that, you know, we can see the facial expressions a bit differently, right? We can notice that people are colored a little differently, right? So this guy here, for example, note the color of his waistcoat and his jacket. And then we look here, different colors of his clothing, right? So when we see these images, we can't assume that they're like photos, that they capture what happened, right? Even photos, of course, are very, you know, can have a lot of bias in them. Okay, if we look closer, we can look at the faces of the British soldiers, and they're often sort of snarling, angry, impassive. They're not very sympathetic figures, right? So we can assume that Paul Revere, which he was sympathetic to the Patriot cause and against the British. So that's one way of looking at things. Then we can look here and we see how the Americans, the Bostonians, are depicted. It's different, right? They're leaning away from the fight. They have their hand up. They're shown weaponless, although they were not in reality weaponless. They're bleeding, right? They're injured. And they've been kind of attacked by these soldiers, which was true. They were attacked. We also can notice, so if we look at this, see it says here Butcher's Hall. I'm just going to go back, and then Custom House down here. I'm going to go back to the main one so you can see kind of where these are in the larger picture. So that's here, Butcher's Hall and Custom House, behind the British soldiers. So Butcher's Hall, right? This is a word that suggests the British are butchers, right? It's like almost a caption over the British. Custom House, this is where taxes were collected, right? So the British are being associated with taxation. But also we notice this, there's a sniper in the window, right? Historically, there was not a sniper in the window. But this is Paul Revere showing, like, not only are the British like these awful, brutish people who are firing into the unarmed civilians, but they're doing it sneakily. They've got a sniper hiding and it's planned out, right? And we can see here, the British officer, the soldiers are in line, and the British officer has a sword raised to give a command, right? So it's very coordinated and planned. We can also note in this image versus this image, they're different, right? I mentioned them being colored, but colored in like differently, right? Like the brown versus black, orange versus blue. But there's another difference. So let's look here. This is supposed to represent this face of someone lying down who's killed in this attack. A man named Crispus Attucks, Crispus Attucks. You don't need to spell it, but just so you have it. Crispus Attucks is one of the martyrs of the Boston Massacre, right? The British kill him. In this image, look at Crispus Attucks' face. Then I'm going to switch to the next image. Here's Crispus Attucks' face here. Crispus Attucks has gone from image 1, where he's white, to image 2, where he's black. And historically, Crispus Attucks was black, right? But in a lot of the images that are colored in by hand of the Boston Massacre, you'll find Crispus Attucks being white. And this is because many people like Paul Revere thought that they wanted their martyrs to be white, right? And they wanted sympathy from people that they didn't think would happen if they acknowledged Crispus Attucks' race. So all of these things are at play here. And so really the takeaway that I want you to have is that we should look at images just as critically and carefully as we look at texts, right? It's easy to glance at this and say, oh, this shows the Boston Massacre, it shows British soldiers killing Bostonians. It does, that happened. But it was also produced in a particular way, right? I won't get into it, but we show the clock here and the moon. All of these things are to indicate it happened at a particular time of day, right? Which was a pro-patriot kind of point of view. It's also useful to know that in 1770, people might be on one side and they might be on another side in 1776, 1780. So let's take one example of kind of an awful person. He's an enslaver that holds hundreds of people in slavery, named Pierce Butler, this guy here. In 1770, Pierce Butler is a British officer near the Boston Massacre. In 1787, Pierce Butler is signing the Constitution on behalf of South Carolina, right? So people can shift a lot, right? In 1770, most people would have considered themselves, most white colonists in the Americas would have considered themselves British in North America, right? Not American or patriots. And it was a process over time where they started to push back against the British. So I'm going to leave you with that. That's kind of the end of our case study video here. I'll leave you with this image, which is kind of the higher quality one, and let you kind of think about how you can analyze this image, right? And we'll have kind of different opportunities in our course to kind of look at images in a critical way again. All right. Please, as always, get in touch with me if you have any questions about this module, the assignment, anything, or you want to meet during virtual office hours. And otherwise, I will see you in Module 4.